Harry Edward Greenwell. Between 1987 and 1989, 3 women working the overnight shift at motels along Interstate 65 in Kentucky and Indiana were sexually assaulted and shot to death with the same .22 caliber handgun. A 4th clerk was attacked in the winter of 1990 and survived long enough to describe the man to a sketch artist. For more than 3 decades, that composite drawing was the closest anyone ever got to knowing who he was. Investigators knew he traveled the highway. They knew his blood type. They eventually had his full DNA profile. And still, they could not put a name to any of it. Vicki Lucille Heath was 41 years old and working the front desk of a Super 8 motel in Elizabethtown, Kentucky, on the night of February 21st, 1987. 2 years later, on March 3rd, 1989, 24-year-old Margaret Mary Gill and 34-year-old Jean Gilbert were both found at Days Inn locations less than 2 hours apart in Merrillville and Remington, Indiana. All 3 women had been alone behind the desk when the man walked in. The pattern was consistent enough that Kentucky State Police publicly linked the murders in 2010. Investigators believed the man was a seasonal traveler of some kind because the attacks clustered between January and March. The theory pointed toward a truck driver, a route salesman, or someone whose job carried him through the same corridor on a schedule. The nickname settled on him in 2 forms: the I-65 killer for the highway, the Days Inn killer for the motels. Neither name did anything to narrow the suspect pool of the millions of people who use that stretch of road every year. So how does a killer who left DNA at 3 separate crime scenes stay anonymous for 35 years? The answer is that DNA alone is only useful if the person who left it, or one of their relatives, is already in a database available to law enforcement. For decades, no such match existed. In 2022, the Indiana State Police, Kentucky State Police, and the FBI worked with genealogists who uploaded the crime scene profile to public ancestry platforms and began building a family tree in reverse. They followed the branches to a close relative, then narrowed the profile to a single man. On April 5th, 2022, Indiana State Police announced the match at a press conference. The statistical probability sat at 99.9999%. His name was Harry Edward Greenwell. Greenwell had been born in Louisville, Kentucky in 1944. His criminal record included armed robbery, burglary, and 2 separate jail escapes. He had worked for the Canadian Pacific Railway, which fit the profile of a man who moved constantly through the Midwest for work. In retirement, he had settled in Iowa, where neighbors later described a charismatic and generous older man they never suspected of anything. Greenwell will never face a courtroom. He died of cancer in Lansing, Iowa, in January of 2013, 9 years before he was identified. Indiana State Police Superintendent Doug Carter made a point at the press conference of refusing to speak his name at length, saying only that the man responsible was no longer on this earth. Investigators have continued to examine other unsolved crimes along the I-65 corridor to determine whether Greenwell can be tied to them as well. As of 2026, no additional cases have been publicly confirmed. The distance a killer can put between themselves and a crime scene is often the exact reason the case stays cold for so long. In the case that follows, that distance was a state line, a quiet retirement, and 45 years of a life lived under everyone's radar. Roger Zotis Brown. On the morning of March 3rd, 1979, a passerby walked through a parking lot in the 8400 block of Hamlin Street in Glenarden, Maryland, and found the body of a young woman. Her name was Catherine Donahue. She was 31 years old, a secretary who lived in Arlington, Virginia. The night before, she had gone out to dinner with coworkers and never come home. She had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and killed. The man who did it left DNA on her body. And then he disappeared into ordinary life for the next 45 years. Catherine Donahue was described by those who knew her as a quiet and steady presence at work. She lived across the Potomac from where her body was eventually found, and there was nothing in her routine that connected her to the parking lot in Glenarden. She had gone out for the evening and expected to be home by a normal hour. Her disappearance was noticed almost immediately. Prince George's County Police investigated the case with the tools available to them in 1979. Detectives worked through her known contacts, co-workers, and neighbors. No suspect emerged. There was no obvious link between Catherine and the location where she had been found. There was no witness. The one thing the killer had left behind was biological evidence, and in 1979, that evidence had nowhere to go. There was no national DNA database. There was no comparison profile. The case slid into the cold case file, where it stayed for 4.5 decades. If the killer's DNA was preserved from the beginning, why did it take so long to identify him? The answer is that traditional CODIS database searches only work when the killer's DNA is already in the system. Roger Brown had a prior armed robbery conviction, but he was not in a database that matched the profile from the Donahue scene. In 2024, the Prince George's County Cold Case Unit partnered with the FBI Baltimore Field Office and the forensic laboratory Othram. Othram specializes in forensic genetic genealogy, the same investigative approach that had solved a growing list of cold cases across the country. Analysts built a family tree from the crime scene DNA, worked their way through relatives, and narrowed the field to a single suspect. The suspect was Roger Zotis Brown. He was 82 years old and living in Pinehurst, North Carolina. In 1979, he had been living in Hyattsville, Maryland, roughly 7 miles from Catherine Donahue. Investigators found no known connection between the two of them. He was not in her workplace, not in her social circle, and not in the neighborhood where her body was found. On March 11, 2025, police arrested Brown at his North Carolina home. A week later, the arrest was announced publicly. Brown was charged with first-degree murder, rape, and related counts. State's attorney Aisha Braveboy stated that he was facing a potential life sentence. He was held in North Carolina pending extradition back to Maryland. As of 2026, no confirmed public update exists on the extradition, indictment, or any trial date. Brown, if still living, would be 83 years old. The case remains legally unresolved. Some killers stay hidden because they leave the state. Others hide in plain sight, across the street from the crime scene, for years at a time. Robert Covington. Deborah Renee Kennedy was 40 years old and worked at the General Motors Tech Center in Warren, Michigan. On the morning of February 20th, 1997, a co-worker became worried when she failed to show up for her shift and asked police to check on her. Officers arrived at her home in the 24,000 block of Lee Baker in Southfield and found her stabbed to death inside her house. There was no sign of forced entry. There was evidence of a violent struggle. And there was DNA under her fingernails from the man who had killed her. Deborah was remembered by her family as someone who worked hard, kept a careful home, and was building a stable life on her own. She had lived on Lee Baker for years. Her neighbors knew her by sight. And one of those neighbors, a man who lived across the street with his wife and his mother-in-law, would eventually turn out to be the person who took her life. Investigators in 1997 collected 2 key pieces of evidence: a fingerprint on a credit card inside the house, and DNA from Deborah's fingernail clippings. Neither piece produced a match. The case went cold and stayed that way for 27 years. In June of 2024, Southfield Police Chief Elvin Barron authorized a full reopening of the file after Detective Brian Weeks asked to review it from the beginning. Retesting the evidence became a priority. If the killer's DNA and fingerprint had been sitting in the file since the beginning, why had they suddenly become useful? The reason was time. Databases had grown. Forensic capability had expanded. Robert Covington had accumulated a criminal record in the years since Kennedy's death, which meant his fingerprint and DNA now existed in systems that had not been searchable in 1997. In January of 2025, the fingerprint on the credit card came back as a match to Covington. In September of the same year, a CODIS search returned a confirmation on the fingernail DNA. The lab work was complete. The next step was locating him. Covington had left Michigan roughly 2 months after the murder. He had spent time in Arizona before settling in Royal Lakes, Illinois. On March 29, 2026, he was arrested in Illinois. On April 8th, he was extradited back to Michigan. He was 58 years old at the time of his arrest. He was charged with felony murder and open murder in the 46th District Court in Southfield. On April 9th, 2026, he was arraigned. He entered a not guilty plea. He was held without bond at the Oakland County Jail. A probable cause conference was scheduled for April 23, 2026. As of the most current available information, Covington remains in custody and awaits prosecution. Sometimes the killer leaves the country entirely, and sometimes, when he does, the courtroom fight over whether he can even be tried again lasts almost as long as the original investigation. John Kevin Woodward. Laurie Houts was 25 years old and worked as a software engineer at Adobe Systems in the early years of what would soon be called Silicon Valley. On September 5, 1992, she was found strangled in her own car, parked near a garbage dump about a mile from her Mountain View, California workplace. A rope had been used. Her purse was on the ground nearby, untouched. Her footprints were on the inside of the windshield, evidence that she had fought for her life in the final moments. The man who killed her had left fingerprints on the outside of the car. Within days, police believed they knew exactly who he was. Proving it in court would take more than 30 years. Laurie had graduated with a degree in computer engineering and had settled into the kind of career that thousands of young engineers were flooding into California to pursue. She lived a routine life, went to work, and had a boyfriend. And her roommate arrangement placed her, without her knowing it, directly in the path of the man who would eventually take her life. The suspect was John Kevin Woodward. He was the roommate of Laurie's boyfriend. Investigators developed a theory that Woodward was jealous of the relationship, that his fingerprints outside her car placed him at the scene, and that his alibi did not hold up. Prosecutors tried him in 1995. The jury hung 8-4 in favor of acquittal. Prosecutors tried him again in 1996. The jury hung a second time, 7-5. After the second mistrial, the case was dismissed for insufficient evidence. Woodward left the country. He moved to the Netherlands and eventually became the CEO of a training company called Ready Tech. How does a suspect walk free twice and then find himself charged with the same crime nearly 30 years later? The Santa Clara County Crime Lab retested the DNA on the rope in late 2020. It matched Woodward. Over 80 latent fingerprints from the original scene were re-examined, and additional prints belonging to Woodward were identified. On July 9, 2022, he was arrested at John F. Kennedy International Airport as he arrived on a flight from Amsterdam. He was charged a third time. The legal fight that followed was extraordinary. In August of 2023, Judge Shella Dean dismissed the case on double jeopardy grounds, ruling that Woodward could not be tried a third time for the same offense. The 6th Appellate District overturned that ruling in 2024, reinstating the prosecution. District Attorney Jeff Rosen welcomed the decision. Woodward's defense pushed the issue up to the United States Supreme Court. In February of 2025, in Woodward v. California, the court denied review. Justice Sonia Sotomayor wrote separately to note that the underlying double jeopardy question was significant, while concurring in the denial. Defense attorney Dan Barton signaled that a federal habeas petition would follow. As of 2026, the third trial is legally cleared to proceed. Woodward has been on home detention in Modesto, California. No verdict has been reached and no plea has been entered. Lori Houtz's family, more than 30 years after her death, is still waiting for a jury to render a final answer. The evidence a killer leaves at a scene does not always require decades of appeals to be useful. Sometimes it sits inside a package of cigarettes for 47 years, waiting for someone to test it. Willie Eugene Sims. Jeanette Ralston was 24 years old, lived in San Mateo, California, and was the mother of a young son. On the night of January 31st, 1977, she went out to a bar in San Jose called the Lion's Den on Almaden Road. Just before midnight, witnesses saw her leave with a man they did not recognize. The next day, February 1st, 1977, she was found strangled in the back seat of her own Volkswagen Beetle in a nearby carport. A long-sleeved dress shirt had been tied around her neck. The killer had tried to set the car on fire and failed. The autopsy showed evidence of sexual assault. The case would go cold for 47 years. Jeanette had spent that evening the way she often did, out with friends. Her son was at home with family. She had gone to a bar she knew well, in a part of San Jose she knew well, and made the ordinary decision to leave with someone. That decision was the last one anyone would remember her making. Investigators processed the Volkswagen in 1977 with the tools of the era. Fingerprints were collected. A pack of Eve brand cigarettes was recovered from inside the car. None of it led anywhere, because there was no eyewitness who could identify the man and no name in the file that fit the sparse description. The killer had done something rare for a stranger crime. He had left the county, then the state, before any of the evidence he had touched could be entered into a searchable system. How does a fingerprint sit inside an evidence bag for almost half a century before it finally identifies someone? In August of 2024, cold case investigators pulled the print off the Eve cigarette pack and ran it through modern fingerprint databases. It matched Willie Eugene Sims. In 1977, Sims had been an Army private stationed at Fort Ord. In 1978, he had been convicted in Monterey County of assault with intent to commit murder. He had moved out of state before his DNA could ever be entered into CODIS. That single procedural gap had kept him invisible for decades. In 2025, San Jose police detectives and investigators from the district attorney's office traveled to Jefferson, Ohio, in Ashtabula County, where Sims was living. They obtained a DNA sample. The DA's crime lab analyzed it. The results, using STR-mix statistical analysis, matched the DNA found on Jeanette Ralston's fingernails and on the shirt used to strangle her. Sims was 69 years old at the time of his identification. He was charged with 1 count of murder in Santa Clara County and faced a sentence of 25 years to life. In early May of 2025, he waived extradition in Ohio to be returned to California. As of 2026, no publicly available information confirms an arraignment date, preliminary hearing, plea, or trial. The case remains active, and prosecution is ongoing. For Jeanette Ralston's son, now in his 50s, the arrest was the first movement in a case that had gone quiet before he was old enough to remember his mother. Not subscribed yet? Now's the time. And if audio's more your thing, find us on Spotify too. You can click the link in our bio. Fred Allen Lieneman. On the evening of July 7th, 1972, Phyllis Baylor left Indianapolis in a borrowed car to drive north to Bluffton, Indiana, to visit her parents. She was 26 years old, a mother, and her young daughter was in the seat beside her. They left around 8 in the evening and never arrived. The next morning, the car was found abandoned on the northbound side of Interstate 69 in Grant County. The hood raised as if something had gone wrong with the engine. About an hour later, a driver passing through Allen County spotted Phyllis and her daughter in a ditch off West Road. The daughter was unharmed. Phyllis had been sexually assaulted and shot to death. Phyllis Baylor was described by her family as a warm and steady young mother, building a life a few hours from where she had grown up. She had planned the drive to her parents' home with no reason to think anything about that summer evening would be different from 100 others she had made before. Investigators from Grant County and Allen County worked the scene the following morning. Evidence was recovered from Phyllis's clothing, but for years, only a partial DNA profile could be developed. That partial profile did do one thing. It actually eliminated the original main suspect in the case, which meant investigators lost a lead they had been counting on. The case had no witnesses, no confirmed enemy in her life, and no active leads. It settled into the cold case files of the Indiana State Police and the Allen County Police Department for more than 5 decades. How does a case with the killer's DNA on the victim's clothing stay unsolved from 1972 all the way into the 2020s? The answer came in 2024, when the Indiana State Police Laboratory finally produced a full and workable DNA profile from that same clothing using modern extraction methods. Indiana State Police and the Allen County Police Department partnered with Identifinders International, a forensic genealogy firm based in California and founded by Colleen Fitzpatrick, one of the pioneers of the field. Identifinders built a family tree from the profile, worked out through relatives who had matched at genealogy databases, and by early 2025 had identified the man responsible. His name was Fred Allen Lieneman. In 1972, he had been 25 years old and living in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, though he had been born and raised near Anderson, Indiana. He had a significant criminal history in the years surrounding the killing, though nothing tied him publicly to Phyllis Baylor's death. There was no known personal connection between him and Phyllis. Nothing in either of their lives placed them in the same social world. He had crossed her path on that stretch of highway in Grant County for reasons he never had to explain to anyone. Lieneman himself had been murdered in Detroit in 1985. He had been beaten to death 13 years after taking the life of Phyllis Baylor, and long before DNA technology had advanced to the point where his own crime could have been proven against him. Officials with the Allen County Prosecutor's Office confirmed that if he had still been alive, they would have charged him. As of 2026, no prosecution is possible. Phyllis Baylor's daughter, who had been in the car that night and survived, has now lived her entire life with the knowledge that the man responsible was identified only after both her mother and the killer were long gone. Indiana State Police announced the identification publicly and closed the active investigation into the death of Phyllis Baylor. The family of a victim is often left waiting for a name that never comes in time. In the case that follows, that name arrived only months after the man responsible had died of natural causes. Ray Anthony Chapa. On April 24, 1986, two co-workers of Janet Elaine Love became concerned when she failed to show up for her shift at Delta Airlines. They drove to her apartment on L. Don Dodson Drive in Bedford, Texas, and found her dead inside. Janet was 32 years old and had moved to Texas from Louisiana just a year earlier to start a new life. She had been sexually assaulted and shot to death by an intruder. The killer left DNA at the scene. For the next 35 years, that profile would sit in the national database, never once producing a match against any known offender. Janet Love was described by family and co-workers as a friendly and ambitious young woman who had recently taken a ticket agent position with Delta. She had settled into a modest apartment in Bedford, a quiet suburb of Fort Worth, and had begun to feel at home in Texas. Bedford police worked the case from every available angle. Detectives interviewed everyone in Janet's immediate world, including her neighbors, her co-workers, and the small circle of people she had come to know since moving to the state. A DNA profile from the scene was submitted to Cody's as soon as the technology allowed it, and it stayed in the system for years. The problem was straightforward. If the killer had never been arrested for a qualifying offense, his DNA would never be in the database. In the case of Janet Love, that was exactly the situation. The profile matched no one. Detective assignments passed from officer to officer, reportedly 15 investigators in total across the decades, and none of them found a viable suspect. If the DNA had been sitting in CODIS the whole time, why did the answer only come 35 years later? The answer arrived through investigative genetic genealogy. In late 2020, Bedford police used a grant from the Texas Department of Public Safety and the United States Department of Justice's Sexual Assault Kit initiative to fund forensic genealogy work on the case. The DNA profile was analyzed by the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification. A genealogist built a family tree, and two of the suspect's relatives voluntarily assisted with a kinship analysis to help narrow the identification. In September of 2021, the match was confirmed. His name was Ray Anthony Chapa. In 1986, he had been just 19 years old and living less than 1,000 feet from Janet Love in a neighboring apartment complex. He had a criminal record for theft and drug possession, but he had never surfaced in the original investigation because his priors had not placed his DNA in the searchable database at the time it mattered. There was no evidence he had known Janet personally. Their apartments simply happened to be close enough that he had passed her building thousands of times in the months leading up to her death. By the time investigators identified him, Chapa was already dead. He had died of a terminal illness in January of 2021, only months before the genealogy team confirmed the match against him. Bedford Police Chief Jeff Williams stated publicly that his department was fully certain of the identification. Investigators worked with the FBI to determine whether Chapa could be tied to unsolved crimes in other places he had lived, including Chicago and Montana. As of 2026, no additional cases have been publicly linked to Chapa, though the review of his known movements remains open. Janet Love's family, who had spent more than 3 decades without any answers at all, learned the name of the man responsible only after any possibility of a courtroom had closed. The identification brought the investigation to an end, but not the kind of end her family had spent 35 years imagining. Some killers stay hidden because their DNA is never in any system. Others stay hidden because the crime scene itself lies in a landscape as vast and empty as the Nevada desert. Arthur Joseph Lavery. On August 27, 1994, two hikers making their way through the Lake Mead National Recreation Area came across the body of a woman near Gypsum Wash, about 10 miles east of Las Vegas. Her name was Melanie White. She was 27 years old and the mother of a young son. She had been strangled with a ligature, suffered blunt force trauma to the head, and dragged by a vehicle into the desert wash where she was left. Investigators from the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department began working the case immediately. The killer had left biological evidence behind. That evidence would sit unmatched for the next 30 years. Melanie White was remembered by her family as someone who cared about how she presented herself and someone who was searching for a new direction in her career. She had a young child at home. Her family understood her as a young mother trying to build a better life for herself and for her son. Homicide detectives with the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department exhausted every available lead in the original investigation. There was no reliable witness to place the killer in the area of Gypsum Wash. There was no known enemy in Melanie's life. Her circle of contacts was interviewed and cleared. In May of 2010, cold case detectives returned to the file with new resources, developed a male DNA profile from the crime scene evidence, and entered it into CODIS. It returned no match. That was the wall the case ran into every time investigators approached it. The profile was clean and the science kept improving, but the man attached to that profile had never been arrested for anything that would place his DNA in the federal system. How does a case with a full DNA profile sit unmatched in a national database for more than a decade of active searching? The answer came from a Nevada nonprofit organization called the Vegas Justice League, which provided funding to submit the case to Uthram in 2021. Uthram is a private forensic laboratory specializing in forensic genetic genealogy, and their scientists used the profile from the Melanie White case to build a family tree. On August 26, 2024, almost exactly 30 years after her body was found in the desert, the suspect was identified. His name was Arthur Joseph Lavery. He had been born on September 7, 1955, and had grown up in the Las Vegas area. In 1994, he had been 38 years old. He had a prior battery charge on his record, but nothing that had placed him in the federal DNA database at the time it mattered. He had eventually moved to California in the mid-2000s. There was no known personal connection between Lavery and Melanie White. He had been a stranger to her, and he had remained a stranger inside the case file for 3 decades. Lavery had died on February 20th, 2021, from heart disease and complications related to COVID-19. He had been 65 years old at the time of his death. Investigators identified him 3.5 years after he had died. There would be no arrest, no arraignment, and no trial in a Nevada courtroom. As of 2026, the case against Arthur Joseph Lavery is closed by identification only. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department announced the resolution publicly and detailed the science that had made it possible. For Melanie White's son, who had grown up without his mother and without answers, the identification was the closest thing to justice available in a case where the man responsible had died before the science could finish catching up to him. The oldest cold cases sometimes end without a courtroom, but not always. In the case that follows, 47 years of silence ended with a guilty plea and a sentence long enough to hold the killer in prison for the rest of his life. David Sinopoli. On December 5, 1975, Lindy Sue Beekler returned to her apartment in Manor Township, Pennsylvania, after a routine grocery run. She was 19 years old. She had been married for about a year. She worked as a clerk in a local flower shop, and she had told friends in the weeks before her death that she felt she was being watched. Sometime that evening, a man entered her home, took a knife from her own kitchen, wrapped a tea towel around the handle, and stabbed her 19 times in the neck, chest, back, and abdomen. When she was found, the knife was still in her neck. For the next 47 years, her name sat on top of the oldest cold case file in Lancaster County. Lindy Sue Beekler was described by those who loved her as a bright young woman who had married her high school sweetheart and was settling into the earliest days of her adult life. She was working, she was married, and she had recently told a few people that she believed a stranger had been following her. The original investigation was thorough by the standards of 1975. Her husband was cleared quickly. Manor Township Police and the Pennsylvania State Police interviewed between 250 and 300 people. No suspect ever emerged. In the year 2000, DNA from semen recovered at the scene was extracted and submitted to CODIS. Every year the profile was rechecked. Every year it returned no match. The case became the defining unsolved file for the entire county. How does a case sitting in a national DNA database from the year 2000 onward remain unsolved for another 22 years? The answer came through a combination of investigative genetic genealogy and a piece of trash left behind at an airport. In 2019 and 2020, the Lancaster County District Attorney's Cold Case Unit partnered with Parabon Nanolabs. Genetic genealogist C.C. Moore built a family tree from the scene DNA and traced a distinctive migration pattern. Families connected to the DNA had emigrated from a small town called Gasparina in the Calabria region of Italy to Lancaster County during the 20th century. Moore narrowed the search to a local Italian-American social club and to families with roots in Gasparina. The suspect she zeroed in on was David Sinopoli, who had lived in Lindy's apartment complex at the time of the murder. In February of 2022, investigators followed Sinopoli to Philadelphia International Airport. They collected a coffee cup he had discarded. The DNA on the cup was analyzed by cybergenetics. According to Lancaster County District Attorney Heather Adams, the match statistic between the airport coffee cup and the semen from Lindy's clothing came in at roughly 10 trillion. In July of 2022, David Sinopoli was arrested at his home in Lancaster. He was 68 years old. On October 19, 2023, Sinopoli pleaded guilty to third-degree murder, aggravated assault, and burglary. President Judge David Ashworth sentenced him to a term of 25 to 50 years in state prison, along with roughly $25,000 in court costs. Ashworth told him from the bench that the depravity of his actions could not be overstated. District Attorney Adams described the sentence as a much-deserved life sentence for a 69-year-old man. Sinopoli never revealed a motive. As of 2026, David Sinopoli is incarcerated in the Pennsylvania State Prison System. Of the 10 cases in this video, his is the only one that has produced a criminal conviction. For the family of Lindy Sue Beekler, a 47-year wait ended not with a suspect who had died before he could be tried, but with a man in a courtroom entering a guilty plea. Not every case ends with the killer in a courtroom. Some end with a man who had been living quietly for decades under a name no one had ever thought to check against a family tree. Stephen Joseph Simcak. On the afternoon of January 11th, 1980, Mark Madger returned home from work to his apartment in the 37,500 block of Grove Avenue in Willoughby, Ohio, and found his wife Nadine dead in the dining room. She had been stabbed more than 40 times. Their young son was unharmed in a playpen in the room nearby. Nadine Madger was 25 years old and a graduate of Cleveland Heights High School. The killer had used a knife from the family's own kitchen. There was no forced entry, no evidence of sexual assault, and nothing missing from the apartment except for a second knife from the same matching set. The case would sit unsolved for the next 42 years. Nadine Madger was described by her family as a quiet young mother who had been building a stable life with her husband and their young child in a suburb east of Cleveland. She had grown up in the area, graduated from Cleveland Heights High School in 1973, and married Mark not long after. She had no known enemies. A neighbor reported seeing a canary yellow Dodge Dart parked behind the apartment complex around the time of the killing, though no one could identify a driver. In 1996, the Lake County Crime Lab identified 2 blood types on Nadine's shirt, her own and that of an unknown male, suggesting that the attacker had been injured during the assault and had bled onto her. In 2014, blood stain pattern analysis further indicated that the injured attacker had stood over her at some point during the attack. The case had detail and it had physical evidence, but it did not have a name attached to any of it. How does a killer leave his own blood at a scene in 1980 and remain unidentified for more than 4 decades? In 2018, the Willoughby Police Department engaged Parabon Nanolabs to perform forensic genetic genealogy on the profile. Investigators built a family tree. A deceased grandson's retained DNA and later DNA from his children helped confirm the match at a genetic distance consistent with a direct parent-to-child relationship. On July 13, 2022, the Willoughby Police Department announced the identification publicly. The killer was Stephen Joseph Simcak. The circumstantial evidence surrounding Simcak lined up with what the neighbor had reported and with what the crime lab had suggested. Simcak had driven a canary yellow Dodge Dart. His employment records from the Lincoln Electric Company showed that he had missed exactly 1 day of work in all of 1980, calling in sick. That single missed day was January 11th, 1980, the day Nadine Madger was killed. Simcak had been about 40 years old at the time. He was an ex-Marine, worked full-time at Lincoln Electric and part-time at other jobs in the area, and had no prior criminal record of any kind. Stephen Joseph Simcak had died on June 18, 2018, at the age of 79, in Bemis Point, New York. His death had come 4 years before he was publicly named as the man responsible for Nadine Madger's murder. Nadine's son later told reporters that his greatest frustration was that Simcak had lived out his years as a free man, never once forced to answer for what he had done. As of 2026, no prosecution against Stephen Joseph Simcak is possible. The Willoughby Police Department has closed the case as identified. Nadine Madger's family finally has the name they had waited more than 4 decades to hear. What they do not have, and will never have, is a courtroom in which to hear it read aloud, or a moment in which the man responsible had to look them in the eye and answer for taking her from them. These are 10 cases where science reached where investigators alone could not. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.